Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. Today we are going to discuss sustainable development and international legal response. Under this lecture, what we plan to do is the fact that we have taken in detail about the legal foundation of sustainability. We have also discussed in quite detail about the evolution and development of the Sustainable Development Law. We have also discussed the course and direction of sustainability law. Now, having a concrete legal foundation of sustainability and the modern concept of sustainable development, which has been permeated into the World Conservation Strategy, Butler and Commission report, and the Rio Declaration 1992, plus Rio plus 5 declaration, along with the three fundamental law dealing with the international law relating to the climate change, international law relating to biodiversity, and international law relating to forestry, forest conservation. We have also taken note of the precautionary principles, polluter-pays principles, common and differentiated responsibility to reflect upon the very basis of the sustainable development under the international law, international environmental law, or we can say that what has been the international legal response to our sustainable development. In this lecture, we will also try to dwell on the issue of institutional and legal change, that how the course and direction, how the modern notion of sustainability and how the evolution and development of sustainability and how the legal foundation of sustainability has paved the way for institutional and legal changes under the Stockholm Declaration, Rio Declaration, and thereafter other environmental summits, conferences. In this respect, dear learner and viewer, we will directly switch over to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conservation of Biological Diversity Convention, and as well as we will be discussing the Agenda 21. Although these aspects has been well covered in greater length and breadth in the previous lecture, in this lecture we will be trying to see that how the development of international environmental law and how the development of sustainability law right from 1972 down to 1992 Rio Declaration plus Rio plus 5 1997 plus Kyoto Protocol 1997 has reflected and accumulated and consolidated into the Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. The Johannesburg Summit has highlighted again the same kind of the concern which Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Premier of India, have echoed in the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in 1972 in Stockholm. The concern was to connect and interconnect the pollution with poverty with that of the sustainable development. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, as then she was the Prime Minister, has observed that the rich nation asking us to control and combat the pollution and conserve the environment. On the other hand, we feel that the poverty is the biggest polluter. The same kind of the perception of the third world nations towards the environment is being revisited in the Johannesburg Sustainable Summit, which highlighted the weakness of the Agenda 21 and recognized the poor progress after the Rio de Janeiro summit and called for a renewed global commitment, particularly in the area of the environmental finance, technology, and capacity building. Johannesburg Summit in 2002 have given rise to WEHAB principle, which deals with, which has been crafted by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and this WEHAB principle stands for the 5 major components of the environment. The first component happens to be the water, the second component happens to be the energy, the third component happens to be the health, fourth component happens to be the agriculture, and the fifth component happens to be the biodiversity. Now, this is a very unique and innovative idea which has been permeated in the Johannesburg Summit in 2002, which has been identified as the key pillars of the sustainability. And this summit emphasized upon the point of reducing global inequality and promoting global solidarity against the global apartheid of the pollution and the poverty. In this lecture, dear learner and viewer, we will be also talking about that what has been the plan of action for sustainable development and its due incorporation in the legal domain. And then we will try to see that how type 1 commitment and type 2 commitment, the type 1 commitment which pertains to the governmental commitment and type 2 commitment which pertains to the partnership based initiative, how it has emphasized some concrete action on water and sanitation, energy, health, agriculture and the biodiversity by creating a kind of a cooperative atmosphere for the environmental finance, technological finance and capacity building to achieve the broad goals of the Sustainable Development Law. In this lecture, dear learner, we will be talking in a great detail about how agriculture, the land reclamation and the land glory is to be achieved so that we must have a sustainable agriculture. And then it also talks about the threats to the biodiversity losses and adopt mechanism to protect and conserve the biodiversity management. The Johannesburg Summit targeted food security and biodiversity protection under the caption of the sustainable development and biodiversity management. It emphasized upon the global environment facility are to be directed for the finance in this area of sustainable agriculture and biodiversity by recognizing the wisdom and the traditional knowledge of the indigenous people and by ratification the Kyoto Protocol to curb the greenhouse gas emission. We will also discussing the assessment and outcome of the World Summit on Environment and Development, Johannesburg Summit 2002, that to what extent the ideals which have been permeated and the foundational values which have been laced in this 2002 summit have promoted a kind of a global unity and the corporate partnership to reduce poverty and to promote equity and strengthen the three pillars of sustainable development which we have discussed during the last preceding lectures, meaning thereby the economic, social and the environmental pillar. We'll be also having a critical look at the shortfalls of the Johannesburg Summit and which has been criticized by many experts and jurists to fall short of the commitment and over-reliance on corporate partnership, and it also tried to say something about some of the successes and failures of the Johannesburg Summit because it failed into concretizing any kind of a binding commitment and agreement and lacked the targets which are very key issues in relation to the poverty, energy, biodiversity, agriculture, health and sustainability. We'll be discussing that how the expectations which have been belied in the Johannesburg Summit will create a kind of an exploratory mechanism to see that how international convention and agreement can be fostered to further expand the existing environmental convention, ratifying pending all legal treaties and negotiate for new sets of the treaties for global cooperation on climate change, biodiversity and hazardous waste. With this, the dear learner and viewer, we will see that what is the legal foundation of sustainability which has been handed down and permeated by a catena of the conventions and the series of the legal reform. In this part, dear learner and viewer, we have taken note of the basic and salient features of the World Conservation Strategy, which have strategized the entire notion of sustainable development to look at how we can be in a better positions to create a kind of a robust atmosphere for the sustainability across the globe. We have taken note of the Butland Commission 1987, which defined the sustainable development saying that it must meet the aspirations and expectations of the present generation without compromising the aspirations and commitments of the future generations. We have taken note of the Rio Declaration 1992, which introduced a very fundamental 27 legal principle for environment protection. As as the Bertland Commission report and the World Commission on Environment and Development expert group of environmental law have deduced 22 principles on human environment. Similarly, the Rio Declaration has produced 27 principles for the environmental protection, and thus taken as a whole, the outcomes of the 22 principles of the World Commission on Environment and Development expert group on environmental law and the Rio Declaration's 27 principles, we can fairly have the idea of the legal foundation of sustainability, which balances economic growth with ecological preservation and social equity. Thus, what we see that the legal foundation of sustainability rests upon the precautionary principle approach, polluter pays principle approach, and common and differentiated responsibility across the globe. Now, whatever has been the legal foundation of the sustainability law, it requires a kind of a radical change in the institutional and legal mechanism and the entire administrative paraphernalia which has been created to achieve the broad goals of the sustainable development. Sustainable development requires aligning human laws with natural ecological process, and in this sense, we must examine that how the 5 steps of the institutional changes, which means that how we can determine the goal number 1, and determination of the goal is important, and then we can assess the institutional rules and regulation and tools and kits and the guidelines, and then we will try to develop a kind of a developmental action plan, and then it will directly be rigorously implemented with the implementing plan, and then after all we can have the assessment and the outcome of the implementation mechanism and all the plan. Thus, this 5 steps framework of institutional change is very important in assessing the role of institutional rules, regulations, and in promoting sustainability. Then it requires that all the nations should unequivocally must ensure environment protection for both current and future generations, that the entire legal system should be directed to such a goal which need a constitutional amendment and the establishment of environmental ombudsman to have a watchdog and the monitoring of the entire sphere of the pollution law, standard setting, pollution control, and environmental protection mechanism. So it requires a massive rehabilitation of the national law. What has been set in the international law, then we must have either the dualistic perspective or we must have a monistic perspective of the international environmental law. And it can suitably be done by what we can say that either the legal adjustment, either the statutory adjustment, either the constitutional amendment, and moreover, from law, we can move to the governance and dispute settlement and a kind of an agency which can be central and nodal, which can keep a vigilance and act as a monitoring authority. Then we will be discussing that what has happened in the institutional and legal changes which are introduced by the Stockholm Declaration, the Nairobi Declaration 1982 and Rio Declaration 1992, how these declarations in totality and in a combined manner have shaped the modern sustainability law to its own perspective. Then we'll be discussing that can at this stage we can have a kind of a universal declaration on environment protection on the lines of universal declaration of human right, so that it can herald the human right to environment, be either in its content of the first generations or second generations or third generations legal reform. Then we will talking about that institutional and legal changes which requires the maintenance of ecological process. It requires the entire ecosystem and biosphere are to be dealt with great honesty and probity. It also required that the biodiversity and the natural habitat must have environment protection standards and have regular environment impact assessment to see the adverse impact on the biodiversity and the natural habitat. We must have sustainable use of natural resources, and this requires implementation our environmental information sharing system and a very robust participation of the public or the government or the semi-government and the non-government. These are some of the basic focus of the institutional changes, meaning thereby it requires a greater upheavals and as well as it requires a greater reform so that we can achieve the goal of sustainable development. In this regard, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, known as the Johannesburg Summit, is very important because it reviewed the decades of progress of the global partnership on the environment, and it also underlined the shortcomings. It primarily emphasized on a socially responsible economic growth, and the socially responsible economic growth is very important for the safeguarding of the environmental resources. And then the Johannesburg Summit 2002 strengthened the global consensus for intergenerational equity and sustainable planning. How the World Summit, Johannesburg Summit 2002, has been a very promising document or the promising exercise and the promising event in after the Rio Declaration, that it tries to scan the economic growth from the human phase and the ecological phase. It also tries to give more strength, vigor, and stamina to the entire institutional and legal changes which are required for intergenerational equity and sustainable planning. The Johannesburg Summit in 2002 also has reaffirmed its commitment to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Convention on Biological Diversity and Forest Principle as the core instrument. It also tried to appraise the entire outcomes and promises and pitfalls of the Agenda 21 in the implementation mechanism. It also adopted United Nations General Assembly's concern about the degradations of environment at an alarming level. And then the Johannesburg Summit calls for a kind of a financing, technology transfer, and capacity building, which is very important to realize the object of the sustainable development with a shared global responsibility and sustainable progress. And thus we see that the Johannesburg Summits being very alert and active in realizing some of the basic threats and challenges, and then underlining and honing its strategy to combat the entire malice or entire throes of transition of the pollution, poverty, and the environment. Then it very intelligently crafted the 5 Wahab principle, which means the water, W for water, E for energy, H for health, A for agriculture, B for biodiversity. And then these principles of Wahab have focused many key areas wherein the Kofi Annan, the US United Nations Secretary General, has emphasized that this is a kind of a global action which reduces inequality and ecological degradation when we realize these key areas. The Johannesburg Summit, which was held in South Africa, and the South African President Mbeki warned that global apartheid between the rich and poor, once again it has tries to interconnect the poverty as well as pollution in a very holistic perspective, and this perspective is very important from the African point of view and as well as the third world point of view. And then the South African President Thomas Mbeki have emphasized that now it is time to fight against the global apartheid because the Africa has fought the racial discrimination and the racial apartheid, but the global apartheid is the apartheid of the poverty and pollution, that has to be combated by the Global Environment Facility. And this conference was well attended by over 100 judges, and they have tried to see that how the ideals which has been permeated in the Wahab principles and the poverty, pollution, population syndrome can be achieved in the legal domain. The plan of action which has been drawn for the sustainable development was of twofold. The one is the type 1, the government, the type 2 is the partnership. Then it talks about that in relation to water, then water and sanitation, it tried to halt the population without access to clean water by 2015. In matters of energy, it also tried to expand the renewable energy and improve efficiency and ensure modern energy access, renewable and non-renewable both, so that the environment should not be depleted and be on the brink of disaster in order to produce the energy. The third dimension of the health as a plan of action for sustainable development was being addressed by using that we must have ensured safe chemical use by 2020 to protect human and the environmental health. And then by outlining, it calls for the partnership by the US, European Union, Asian Development Bank, and other United Nations initiative of significant funding in the area of water, energy, and health. As a plan of action, it has also been very careful and not oblivious of the fact that the sustainable agriculture and biodiversity management are two major areas of the Wahab principle. Therefore, the summit has highlighted the food security and biodiversity and sustainable agriculture as one of the important action plan for sustainable development. Then, by devising the means and mechanism for sustainable agriculture and biodiversity management, the Food Security and Biodiversity and Sustainable Agriculture Summit through the Global Environmental Facility prioritized about combating desertification and land degradation, because the land degradation and the desertification have been one of the major stumbling block to have the sustainable agriculture and the biodiversity management. Thereby, the US pledged for 90 million for sustainable agriculture program in developing nations. Then it also set agenda for the biodiversity goals by reducing species loss, fisheries, and indigenous knowledge. It also tried to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, which marked towards the global climate accountability. So these are some of the major plan of action and sustainable development as a natural outcome of the Johannesburg summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. Then we see the assessment and outcome of the summit. We will be having a kind of a very critical look. We can say that as Johannesburg summit have scanned and appraised the pitfalls and the promises of Agenda 21, we must see that what are the premonitions and predicament which have permeated into the Johannesburg summit, and how civil society, business sector have pledged for the responsibility for a change in the environment, sustainable development by emphasizing on the three pillars known as economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Then we see the assessment and outcome. It also we have to see that whether it is more humane, equitable, and sustainable society, how and in what way that the Johannesburg summit have created a kind of a discussion and a discourse to have a human, equitable, and sustainable society, and how the three pillars of the sustainable development, such as economic, social, environmental sustainability, can be achieved by the partnership of the civil society and the business, industry, government, semi-government, and the people's participation. In this respect, the assessment and outcome of the Johannesburg summit, we find certain shortfall because it created some diluted promises and it lacks some binding international commitment, as has been the case of the Rio de Janeiro. At least the Rio Declaration has resulted in a series of binding international commitment and have evoked massive ratification and responses by the member states. The Johannesburg summit also falls short of the over-reliance on corporate partnership which undermined the global accountability. It also is lacking and lagging behind in an action plan because some of the action plan are too broad and too open-ended, and it happens to be very vague and non-binding and lack some clear-cut time-bound targets. Some of the critics have opined that the Johannesburg summit is a summit for rich with minimal benefit to the poor, although the Thomas Mbeki has said that we have to fight the global apartheid of the poverty in order to protect the environment and sustainable development. But it is being criticized being summit for the rich because the over dependence on the corporate finance for achieving the goals of the Johannesburg summit. It appears that it is rich-centric proposals and summit. It failed to achieve new measurable goals beyond existing United Nations Millennium Goal, which happens to be very vague, not very clear, not very succinct, and not in unmistakable terms. Thus, we see that there is a need, despite all the major international conventions which has been permeated right from Stockholm Declaration down to Johannesburg Summit, there is a need for a strengthening international convention and agreement to ratify and implement and recommend some of the scientific and technical advancement, and it called for new global agreement on climate, hazardous waste, and biodiversity. It also tries to see that how 22 guiding principles for environment protection and cooperation can be translated into the legal language and advocacy, marshalling the argument for a stronger commitment and for a stronger legal framework of the sustainability. Thus, we see that the entire strengthening of the international convention and agreement requires not only the ratifying of the global and regional convention, but there is a constant engagement and negotiation of global and regional convention or arrangement which requires certain very concrete legal solution for the climate change, management of the hazardous waste and chemicals, containing of the transboundary movement of the hazardous waste, and conservation of biological diversity. It also required a coordinated and concerted effort of Sustainable Development Agency, and time to time it needs periodic review of the convention and having some kind of an informative suggestion by technical and as well as scientific information. With this, dear learner and viewer, what we tries to do in this lecture on Sustainable Development Law and international legal response, we directly devoted to that stock-taking exercise of the course and direction of the sustainability law, the evolution and development of sustainability law, and how these two have formed the legal foundation of sustainability, and how they call for a bigger change or a massive change and institutional and legal reform, and to what extent these legal foundation of sustainability and institutional and the legal reform has been promoted by Johannesburg Summit in terms of the finance, in terms of technology, in terms of capacity building, in terms of introduction of 5 VHAB principles on water, energy, health, agriculture, and biodiversity, how it has carved out type 1 and type 2 kind of a plan of action for government and the partnership based, how it tries to encompass this sustainable agriculture with biodiversity, making climate change, making desertification law as one of the solution, and then the assessment and outcome of the World Summit in promoting, reducing the poverty, promoting equity, and strengthening all the pillars of sustainable development fall short of the expectation, and how further we can go about for the strengthening the international convention and agreement to see that the legal foundation of sustainability, which has emerged from 1972 down to 2002 in 4 decades, can have a better solution for the entire world in creating a very robust global order for environment and sustainable development. With this, my dear learner and viewer, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.